2018. So now let's cross over into that conversation on DNA identification, some of the issues that you need to take note of. Dr. Mercy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Joy. And I think earlier on part one of our Health Digest, we looked at disaster victim identification. And while looking at this, we were talking to a pathologist, Professor Ogena, who was telling us about how they go about forensic identification using DNA. And with me in studio, who will give us a different look, is Dr. Myrna Kalsi. Myrna Kalsi is a forensic odontologist. She has an MSc in forensic odontology from the University of Western Cape in South Africa and a bachelor's degree in dental surgery from the University of Nairobi. And she'll tell us what forensic odontology is all about and what is odontology and what she does on a day-to-day basis. She has worked as a dental surgeon at Moi District Hospital in Voi. She has also worked at the Division of Forensic and Pathology Services at the Ministry of Health, and she has also worked. For the Middle East, that is Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Yemen, Kuwait, and the Gulf Cooperation countries. And one of the major achievements she got from there was the post-conflict diplomatic mechanisms, where she worked on the Iran-Iraq War 1980 to 1988 file and the Iraq-Kuwait war file of 1990 to 1991. Obviously, this is just a summarized version of what her achievements have been and what she has studied to be an expert in forensics, and that is what we shall be talking about. And I will bring it right to you, Dr. Kalsi. Who is an odontologist in simple language?
Well, thank you, Mercy, for having me here. I really appreciate being hosted by another medical colleague. So basically, an odontologist, a forensic odontologist, is an expert or a forensic specialist who examines dental evidence. So that's basically what I do. But what I do is part of a bigger field which we call forensic human identification, or why we're here discussing disaster victim identification, of which forensic odontology is a part of it. Forensic genetics, which is DNA analysis, is also a part of it.
Okay. So you work at the Office of the Government Pathologist.
Yes, I do.
One of the main questions that have arisen since the recent tragedy of the Moi Girls Nairobi High School fire is, why do we need this DNA testing?
Well, it depends on a situation like Moi Girls and any other situation where you have burnt human remains. Will require, will bring you to the point as an expert where you're dealing with the condition of a human body which is unidentifiable for victims or relatives or the society in general. And, you know, it's very traumatic for families or a community or even a state to be able to look at human remains and declare them burnt beyond recognition or unidentifiable. And when I say unidentifiable, I mean visually you cannot identify who this person is. And so that plunges you into a process that we call disaster victim identification, which is a term coined by Interpol, or what we call forensic human identification, which is where you have multiple individuals who have died in a certain incident, and you want to use scientifically proven methods to identify them and eventually return them to their actual family members.
Okay, so that DNA is one of the scientific methods of identifying.
Right.
Now, to specifically what you've trained in, which is odontology and which has to do with somebody's dental formula.
Right.
Do we often do this in Kenya?
Unfortunately, we don't, and this is because not many people have access to dental treatment. Generally, worldwide dental treatment is quite expensive, and so you find in a context like ours, which is that of a developing country, people mostly run to the dentist for very simple procedures, which is, for example, an extraction. So someone comes to the hospital and tells you, daktari, tafadhali ng'oa hii meno kwa ajili nasikia uchungu sana, you know. And it's a very unfortunate situation, because as dentists, as professionals who graduate in the profession of dental surgery, we are taught to look at a patient in a holistic manner. So you look at the patient and see what kind of treatment you are going to offer this patient, and what is your differential diagnosis from what you see inside the patient's mouth. But the patient usually comes with one complaint and they want one solution, and they want you to take out their tooth. And so unfortunately we don't have the appropriate kind of ante-mortem records for a large number of the population that would allow us to conduct more forensic dental identifications, as opposed to, you know, for example, during the tsunami in December 2004, there were very many foreigners who passed away in that incident, and because they had good dental records, they had this holistic treatment in their countries, they had there was access to their dental records. There was a high success rate in terms of dental identification for those victims. But when you look at the kind of disasters we have, you don't generally have this kind of information. Neither do you have a team that goes to collect information of a person before they die, which is what we call ante-mortem data collection. So we don't have a team that does this, and yeah, this is a challenge with you, because, sorry if I say this, but because the basic premise of an identity is to compare. So if you are unable to have a record to compare to, then it becomes very difficult to do any kind of forensic human identification.
So now the question I would then ask you next is, how unique are dental formulas?
I mean, the dentition of a human being is very unique. If we take a radiograph, which in layman's terms is an X-ray, you will find that the teeth are very, very unique. The patterns of the body in terms of the head and the neck region, especially the dental formula, is very, very, very unique.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now, when do we decide, or when is it decided that you'll do DNA testing as opposed to identifying using a dental record, assuming that we had somebody's dental records present?
Sorry, say that again.
When is it decided, or as pathologists, when do you decide to identify somebody using DNA and his or her dental records, if the dental records are present?
I mean, I think the one thing to understand is there are primary methods of identification. So, for example, fingerprint analysis is a primary method of identification. Comparing dental records is another primary method of identification, and then DNA analysis is another primary method. Now, those are the key primary methods that you have. Other evidence on a dead body, for example, their clothing, any other kind of medical identifiers, like someone could be wearing a pacemaker, a prosthesis, all these are, and the circumstantial evidence around the incident, all this becomes a secondary method of identification. So ideally, nobody should ever use one method only to identify a body. And the idea is that forensic human identification is a complementary field. So you use the fingerprint analysis, you have the dental records, you have the DNA, you have the circumstantial evidence that all comes together to give you a scientific identification. Unfortunately, when you have human remains that are in a condition, for example, they're burnt, and what you're dealing with is human remains that are cremated, what we call cremains, then it becomes very, very difficult to identify. You cannot lift fingerprints because now you don't have the fingerprints, you don't have the soft tissue. Sometimes you find that the fire is so bad, so you have tooth destruction. So all you're left with is, I mean, the clothing is all burnt out. I mean, most of the time, all you have is hopefully some DNA that you can get.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other questions that are arisen over the 2 weeks since the Moi incident, and also following the Garissa University terror attack, the fire that we had at Naivasha, and many other of these incidences where you've had to do victim identification, is that the DNA results take so long to come back. While people expect to have them within hours or days, it takes weeks. So the question is, why does it take that long?
Well, a DNA analysis or DNA testing is a complex procedure. So unlike a blood test in which you will go to a hospital and you think you have malaria or you have an infection, they draw blood and within 15, 20 minutes you have some kind of report. This is not the same for DNA analysis. For example, in DNA analysis you have a process to pull out the DNA. You can have a blood sample, a saliva sample, a muscle sample, a hair sample, a sample from somebody's toothbrush. You can have a semen sample. Depending on the kind of samples you have some substance, and from this substance we're literally pulling out the DNA. So we're trying to remove the code of this human being. And when now, for example, you have remains that are burnt, it becomes very difficult to even get a good sample. But luckily, I would say that the remains, when you have burnt remains like that of human remains, you will find most of the time there's quite a bit of destruction around the limbs, upper and lower, but you still have the tissue of the main abdomen, and we are able to get good enough samples for DNA analysis. Now, the reason that it takes long is because DNA testing is a process where you have to extract the DNA, and then you have to do what is called quantification of DNA, amplification of that DNA, and then analysis of what you get. And then what you get is also then is a mathematical calculation, of that population and the likelihood that we are related. So it's complex. I have to say though, since the days of the Nakoma downtown fire to where we are now, I'm seeing as somebody working in the Office of the Government Pathologist, that our colleagues in the Office of the Government Chemist have really been trying to reduce that turnaround time. And I mean, within like 2 weeks is really an acceptable time to have DNA results. It is an acceptable time, and I mean, I think that time is time that should be commended. I just understand also that families have an urgency. And I think this is the other thing, that we cannot put experts or processes under pressure. Though I do understand it's very traumatic for families.
Then I have a question from many of our viewers, that DNA sampling is done only from, when you're trying to match, only from mothers and not fathers. Is this true?
I mean, this is not true. I think we have integrated the social dynamics of our context into the scientific processes of forensic genetics, that is DNA analysis. A human being inherits a set of DNA from their father and their mother. So DNA analysis, as long as you're a biological parent or biological relative, then, then there is no problem to take your sample for DNA as a family reference sample to match against the sample that we have from the human remains. But because of the context in which we are and the social dynamics around relationships, then you find that sometimes some parents may not even know that the child is not there. So while we're doing the DNA test, you know, I mean, the experts in the government chemists are doing the test, you end up finding out information that you didn't necessarily know beforehand, and then it becomes very complex because it becomes then an ethical issue. You know, do you tell this father who thinks he's the father that the child is not, you are not related to this child, you know. So those are just some of the complications, and I would leave it for my colleagues in the government chemist office to, you know, when there is an incident, they actually do come talk to the families and then try to retrieve the samples.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, Weekend Prime will continue.